We've had a number of really interesting and very enlightening conversations, and I think today's is going to be one of the best yet. It's on a problem that's on the tip of everyone's mind, and that's affordable housing. What is the federal government doing? What is New York State doing? What is this new mayor doing? The rent's so high, there's not enough places to live. What are we doing as a society to address this? And in the world of real estate and the built environment, we have some control over this, a limited amount, but some control. And so we're bringing you now the top experts to kind of help us delve into that area and what we can do and expect in terms of not only housing policy, but the development of affordable housing in the future. With us today is my colleague, Professor Gerard Delane. He's an adjunct professor with SHAC. He's an experienced real estate developer with a skill that includes design, construction, finance, affordable housing, and asset management. Gerard is currently the CEO of the Delaine companies. The firm focuses on workforce housing in urban communities across the country. His current focus is utilizing access to capital markets, improving communities through real estate finance and development. Gerard has been in the real estate development sphere for 10 years now. He spent the first 5 years in his career at Forum Architect and Interior Design. The majority of his efforts focus on project managing affordable housing projects in the Southeast region of the United States. He has a bachelor's degree and a Bachelor of Arts degree in architecture from Florida A&M University School of Architecture and Environmental Technology. He has a Master of Science degree from that very esteemed institution, NYU SHAC Institute of Real Estate. I'm going to hand this program over to Gerard now so that he can introduce the remainder of our panelists.
Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning for those in the West Coast. My name is Gerard Delane, and I'm joined by some wonderful folks to discuss a number of variables as it relates to affordable housing. So first up, we're joined by Erica Keller, an experienced real estate developer located in New York City. Hello, Erica. She attended both New York University, Boston College, and the College of St. Rose. She has, started her career as a teacher, served for 10 years in New York City Department of Education before taking over the family business of construction and development. Erica has built upon Bristol Builder's career on building, HUD buildings and working with faith-based organizations. So, Erica, thank you so much for joining us today. Wonderful, wonderful. Also joining us today is Anthea Martin. Anthea is Senior Vice President based in the Denver office of Bellwether Enterprise. She has over 20 years of experience in multifamily finance, specializing in loan originations, both in market rate and affordable multifamily. As you can guess, she's been pretty busy financing FHA, HUD, and all the different agency lending platforms. Throughout her career, she's been responsible for structuring, underwriting, and closing over 80 transactions, which totals over $1 billion worth of transactions. Anthea, welcome. And lastly, joining us today is my colleague, Andrew Foley. Andrew, my man, he and I went to NYU together, so he's a good friend of mine. He is Associate Director of Development at Jonathan Rose Companies. If you didn't know, Google them. They're a leading developer of green and affordable and mixed income housing across America. Started in 1989, Jonathan Rose Companies has completed over $3.2 billion worth of projects. They currently own over 15,000 apartments in 19 states. And Andrew oversees specifically New York and DC development deals. So we'll definitely talk about some of those projects today. So before we jump into our panel, we'd like to jump to my colleague, Darby Curtis.
Thank you, Gerard. Let me just share my screen and open up.
So this is going to be an exciting presentation on the passive house concept.
This,
housing.
So not, okay, can you see my screen here?
No. Have you made her a co-participant?
Yes, if you want, I could.
You know, if you don't mind pulling it up, Gerard, for some reason it's not sharing, it could be on my end, that would be great. Meantime, I'll
problem.
give I'll give a brief introduction. Yeah, as Gerard said, I'm a partner at Curtis Ginsburg Architects, where we really specialize in sustainable, affordable housing in New York City. And I'm going to talk briefly, very briefly, to give the panelists time to talk, just an overview of sort of where we are and where we should be on sustainable design and the importance of it, particularly in the affordable housing world. You have to find it, George. Sorry about that. My computer's just not letting me share. It's on my end.
Mine is going slow. My computer's going slow too. Zoom kind of slows the computer down a little bit. Give me 1 second.
While we're waiting, I'll ask Andrew a question, because as a professor himself, right, that specializes in affordable housing, have you seen the conversation raised to a fever pitch, or is it still a dull raw? And do you think people are concerned enough to put money behind this needed resource?
Regarding passive house?
Or no, affordable housing in general.
Oh, affordable housing just broadly.
Filling the blank while she's pulling up the slides.
Sure. Yes, I think, in terms of resources, I think that investors have realized that affordable housing can actually be a really great investment it tends to be a stable investment when things are good, when things are bad. And I think there's a recognition that, there's a lot of public funding that is put into affordable housing clearly, but I think the private capital is very active in affordable housing around the country. And I know Anthea could probably speak to that more than I can about just how active this has become as a recognized investment for funds.
We're going to eventually see from Darby one of the trends, which is passive house, but what are some of the other growing trends in affordable housing that you're seeing?
There's good trends and not so good trends that we're seeing. I think the greening of buildings that Darby will talk about is certainly a trend that we're seeing continue to grow and be adopted across the industry. We're also seeing more of a shift to building affordable housing in high opportunity areas. A lot of affordable housing, the incentives were structured in a way where low income, fairly lower opportunity areas received almost, more of a weighting in some of the resources that we use to build. I think there's a recognition that we need to start building more affordable housing in areas that have already good infrastructure, access to good public schools, access to grocery stores. And so I think that's been a really positive trend that we're seeing. The need for affordable housing remains stubbornly high across the country and is only deepening. Cities are seeing just a growing amount of severely burdened households, meaning that they spend over half of their income on rent and housing costs, and that it's a national crisis that needs to continue to be addressed. And there's things that I think we can certainly do to do more to encourage that. I think just maybe speaking a little bit narrowly, I think a lot of things, a trend that I think all developers and owners of affordable housing are experiencing right now is that we're in this kind of dual environment where we're seeing interest rates grow, incredibly. So we have a project that has grown, interest rates have been climbed 100 basis points in the last couple of months. Just putting a lot of pressure on our budgets. Meanwhile, we're also seeing costs increase in this environment. And so it's kind of more of a narrow kind of near-term thing that we're all grappling with, but that's certainly a trend that has gotten a lot of us focused and spending a lot of our time. How do we continue to build housing where the cost of money and the cost of building materials has dramatically increased in the last couple months alone?
Yeah, that's a big question that came on this scene rather suddenly. Anthea, maybe you want to comment on that, or how are interest rates currently impacting the lending area?
Sure. I don't know if you noticed, Andrew went like this when he started talking about interest rates.
He got ahead of it.
Exactly the sentiment I think all of us feel. As he mentioned, I mean, we've had just so many constraints, supply chain issues and cost issues. And then now with interest rates, it's constraints that we don't really need in the affordable housing space, but ones that we're just going to have to deal with. It is what it is. Today should be telling. I think today, whatever the Fed meeting decides will hopefully lower, increase. I mean, obviously
They're going to increase
I mean, obviously we have a long-term upward trend, but how much of that is already built into the 10-year treasury? Today will tell. Yeah. Since March 1st, we went from 1.72% to 2.97%. So that's 125 basis points. To give you an idea of how that affects the deal, I had signed up a $26 million affordable housing transaction here in Colorado, and every 25 basis point increase to that deal equated to $750,000. So it went from a deal where they were going to be taking out a couple $1 million to a deal where they now had to bring a couple $1 million to the table. So in the short term, I think the impact is going to be bigger. All of our clients are really just adjusting. We're all adjusting now to what we know is going to be long-term higher interest rates. So I'm hoping that the shift in perspective will be that we're going to be increasing. Everyone will go into deals knowing that they'll have to have a bit of a cushion. What that looks like, nobody knows, but I think it's really important right now for everyone to stress their deals pretty significantly just to know where that breaking point is.
So Andrew mentioned that the housing crisis is a situation that is countrywide, but do you see it more activity in certain parts of the country in terms of affordable housing than others? And are they focusing in on certain things differently, whether it be preservation or ground up development transactions?
Sure, that's a great question. I think it really depends what type of affordable housing you're talking about. You know, historically, we've had a lot of public housing in New York, Chicago, and LA. So in those markets, we're seeing a lot more preservation deals being done. We have a lot of tax credit activity being new tax credit deals being done ground up in Atlanta, Columbus, and Jacksonville. I think it really comes down to where the tools are. We are going to see a lot of the ARPA funds, which are in a lot of the larger states right now. And those ARPA funds are going to be essential for providing the gap funding that's needed to get these affordable housing deals done.
That's interesting. Erica, what do you anticipate will be the impact on the market rate and affordable housing if 421A expires and isn't replaced? Maybe you can explain 421A to the people that are not familiar with it and then kind of give your opinion on it. I think you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
I can.
So 421A was a tax abatement program in New York State that allowed for certain abatements on property in reference to the taxes that would allow developers to benefit in a way and made the actual asset feasible, because you know the taxes are very high in New York City, in New York State, and therefore it eliminated the opportunity to bring affordability to projects if you did not have these tax abatements. And so there has been a lot of controversy around these programs over the years. I think there's been a lot of misunderstanding about the implications of the program. Unfortunately, you know, they've made many revisions over time where they've tried to mandate a certain level of affordability in order to ensure that there was fairness and equity and that people weren't taking advantage of the program. So I'm a strong advocate for just continue to revise and make it work, as opposed to throwing something out completely, right? And so I think throwing it out completely puts us in a situation where, again, you don't have an opportunity now to look at certain neighborhoods, as Andrew had spoken of, where, you know, there's structure already in place, you know, they're middle to high income neighborhoods where accessibility for people of lower incomes is not available. And so I think, you know, 421A provided an opportunity to create units in those neighborhoods so that there was fair access for everyone, right? And so I think, you know, they're looking now at, I think it's called 485W and other options. And so I think it's important that we think about this smartly and we come up with a way to ensure that there is continued opportunity throughout the metropolitan areas like New York City, so that there's opportunity for people of various socioeconomic statuses to live in neighborhoods that have access.
421A received bad press, and then the governor tried to revise it, but it wasn't included in the budget, which surprised a lot of people moving forward. Do you feel that it will move forward maybe closer to April or closer to June or sometime forward? They can't ignore the issue, right? It's top of mind on most politicians' plate because people don't have enough housing as it stands, correct?
Right. I mean, I'm thinking that, you know, there's so much focus now on other things like the interest rate and such that sometimes these things then sneak in, right? Like Roe versus Wade, all of a sudden it kind of snuck in because people were focused on other things, right? So I think that, you know, hopefully there will be an opportunity for it to be seriously, you know, considered to get in, to come up with a way to save the program, whether it, again, it's a revision or such, to ensure that there's these opportunities. And I think that as we get closer, people are going to focus on other things. And I think that we will see it get into the budget. Hopefully.
Andrew, maybe you can answer this. The mayor is also making this one of his top priorities, but he's dealing, as we've said, with some other issues that are top of mind right now, crime, subway safety, education issues, the idea of the pandemic and are people safe, mask or no mask. But affordable housing is something that he ran on, he was supporting. Where do you see that coming out on the city legislative side of things?
Well, you know, I think we all have to acknowledge that the new mayor has a lot of challenges to work through coming out of COVID. And I think we've also, as the affordable housing development community, enjoyed a period of time where there was an unprecedented investment in affordable housing under the de Blasio administration, unlike not only New York has ever seen, but the world has never seen. And I think the industry had gotten very used to that level of continued investment in affordable housing because we all know that New York certainly needs it. I think, you know, we as advocates for affordable housing would love to see the mayor be doing more to put more money and make it a higher priority. But I think we all also have to recognize that there are other issues as well that need the administration's attention right now. I think one bright spot has been that the collaboration between the mayor and the governor is really great and really positive. And after many years where there was a little bit of animosity between Albany and City Hall that I think was counterproductive to building affordable housing and many other priorities for the state. So, you know, I think there's going to be some really good new initiatives that arise as a result of that closer working relationship, and we're all standing by to see.
So I'm going to ask Gerard to add into this, and then I'm going to kind of circle back to you to ask you about some of your more interesting projects, the Sendero Verde, as well as the story behind the Gowanus Green. But right now, why don't I hand it back to Gerard? You might have something to add in this particular discussion. And then if we've gotten things working correctly, Darby has her passive housing presentation to present. We'll try it again. Gerard.
Wonderful. So, you know, I tell our students, Brian, that to do affordable housing, you typically need, you know, either cheap or free land, you need subsidy, you need tax abatements. And in places like New York City, you kind of need all three. because our land is really high and our hard costs are really high, and it's a long and complicated process. So if you take one of those things out of the equation, it's very difficult to do. And I think that's kind of the greater context of the 421A is without that important piece, we may not be able to build as much. And to add to what Andrew just said, there's a contingent of New York City that wants less construction. That's kind of the reality of things. We may have less construction than we had before. And I think that's just kind of like potentially the direction things are headed.
Right.
So,
are we able to see Darby's passive house now, a bright spot in,
yes.
in the affordable housing arena?
Thank you,
One
George.
second.
Yay.
Okay, you can go to the next slide, but thank you all for having me and thank you for your patience. I'll be brief about this. Gerard, you can go to the next slide. Just, you know, as this group of panelists are aware, and as I hope most of the students are aware, affordable housing is a big crisis in this country, and there are many things we want to design to and for. It's not just to create a housing unit or a home for a resident. It's also about its impact on the community and the city at large and the world at large from a sustainability and resiliency standpoint, which we've seen after Hurricane Sandy and various other things, the importance of it, and climate change. And this extends from the unit to the building as a whole, the urban design, its relationship to the rest of the community, and also just the social interaction that happens at the street level as well. Next slide, please, Gerard. And unfortunately, climate change really has a disproportional impact on lower income communities. And we've seen that really worldwide, from flooding to fires to overheating to issues of asthma and other things. Continue. And as we know, the focus here is a bit on passive house design. Our firm has done a number of these projects. Passive house was first developed in Northern Europe. It's been in the States for a while now, but over the last 8-10 years or so, it's become more popular is not quite the right word, but used a bit more in the US, and it comes out of a lot of things. But the big thing about passive house, and the difference between that and what you'll see in LEED buildings is it's really about comfort and resiliency. Very thick insulated walls, various other things to really create an environment that can sustain climate change, outage, energy outages, things like that. And it's really about creating those comfortable zones using as little mechanical systems as possible. It's really a passive related systems, and this also allows residents to dictate a bit what their comfort zone is and what they want it to be. Continue, please. And really, it's cutting edge, but cutting edge without being highly technical in certain ways. And some of the things that are important as we look at sustainability and resiliency, and we always put the two together because it's very important in New York and beyond, is also working with developers and realizing there's a cost, there's some additional cost to this. We've been able to do it with really maybe 5 to 10% cost increase, a fairly low cost increase relative to the lower energy needs of the buildings, and also at the same time really looking at some of what the city is implementing, Local Law 97, which is carbon reduction for buildings, the need for solar panels, which has some complications, and also looking at existing buildings. New York City is full of existing buildings, and that's where a lot of our affordable housing needs to come from in certain ways. It's improving the residencies we have there. And with that comes electrification in both existing buildings and new construction. Next, please. And so this is just an example of LEED, and I threw LEED in there because Castle Gardens on the bottom right was done before we started doing passive house. It's about 12 years old. But buildings can range in size, shape, configuration program, from mixed income to all affordable to supportive housing. Beach Green Dunes is right on the ocean, therefore it also has resiliency elements to it, raising the buildings, things like that. Park Avenue Green on the lower left, I think may still be the largest passive house multifamily affordable building in the country. Continue, please. And getting into some and then we get into some of the nitty-gritty details. And I include this because as sort of developers and future developers to understand that we're not reinventing the wheel in a lot of this. A lot of it, we're developing airtight construction. The detail on the lower right is really how to take a standard detail of putting an air conditioner through the wall air conditioner in, and how to develop it in such a way that it will have the air sealing and all the requirements to allow for a passive house building. Next, please. Third Avenue uses a lot of, was one of our first passive house buildings, also LEED Platinum. And really, as you can see, it's a 70% less energy usage, which when you're thinking about developing affordable housing, where the majority of the time it's for a not-for-profit or a developer who's managing the building, it both lowers the cost for you and it lowers the cost for the resident, the residents as well, along with creating that healthier building. And often, as you've seen here, it's a daycare facility, also integrating that commercial space into the passive design. Continue, please. And when we think about a lower carbon future, and I think this is good, important for New York and all over the country, I'm going to throw this in there, is really looking at the density of our housing in general, not just affordable housing. And these diagrams, which are representative of California, just show the difference between Tower in the Park versus mid-level community development. And that density increase is really important towards lowering our overall carbon footprint, and also thinking about mass transportation, amenities, waste reduction, and various other things. Continue, please. We're just going to go through very quickly some examples of some of our work. These are also passive house buildings, but for Help USA, it's a full block development, but really looking at creating that mid-rise and high-rise development, but still allowing for the green space, increasing the number of units per acre, and also allowing for support services that are often important in some of the affordable housing that gets developed. Continue, please. Marcus Garvey is an interesting example, and I know some of this may come into discussion later, because it first started as upgrade of 99 low-rise existing buildings, but also provided the opportunity for development of more mid-rise buildings on the empty lots, given the available FAR and other things, and includes full photovoltaics and electrification of the existing buildings, and the new buildings are enterprise green communities for the first two, which are finishing up construction and may go to passive house for the future ones. Continue, please. Navy green, which is another example of the use of full block development with the integral green space on the inside, commercial space. The interesting thing about this project is that it mixes both affordable, supportive, market rate, and high-end, now high-end townhouses, because the neighborhood in Brooklyn's gone a bit upscale from when the project first started. Continue. And then also, the other, as I mentioned before, sort of renovation and adaptive reuse is very important. We're doing many projects with New York City Housing Authority, Rad projects. We're really looking at where we can recladding to increase the energy efficiency of buildings, going to electrification, photovoltaics where we can. You can see Marcus Garvey on the lower left as well. Continue, please. And then this is another example of a new passive house building that's will go up in NoHo, where we're looking at both. This is for LGBTQ seniors, but also looking at how it integrates with the community and creating a public space for them as well. And I think Castle Gardens I may have mentioned earlier, but this is this is supportive and affordable housing, a not-for-profit, and often many of these projects do involve not-for-profit and the integration of developers with not-for-profits, and And the really importance on our end of sort of having both teams involved early on in the process really helps us to understand the goals from the development side and also the goals, the programmatic side from with the not-for-profit who is running the facility. Continue, please. I think that may be it. Yes, and thanks. Any questions you can ask later on, but just to give an overview.
Very exciting stuff. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. From a finance standpoint, though, Anthea, are these easier to get money for or harder, or do we just have the right political clout behind it in each instance?
I would call those lasagna deals. I think you need many, many layers of subsidies to make deals like that work. The good thing about it is that you tend to attract lots of good CRA-driven banks, which will give you great terms pricing that you really couldn't get from like the agencies, for example. But easier, no. Hairy, yes. Complicated, very difficult deals to get done. There are just so many different government agencies that you have to work with, and that's the most difficult piece of it.
Yeah, really good answer. And people don't realize that, but I think a big part, Erica, of projects like this is your community face and the type of dialogue you have, and salesmanship, not only outside, but inside as well. What would you say to that?
I mean, I can speak specifically to the work that we do, right? And we try to be very grassroots in our approach to the development of the community, as well as offering affordable housing. We work primarily with faith-based organizations, and oftentimes churches are in a position now where they cannot survive off of tithes and offerings, and they have large edifices that are in disarray. And they have looked to affordable housing as one of the ways in which they can preserve their community facility space, as well as offer ministry in the form of housing to the community. And so, I think thinking creatively with different owners and thinking about what are the needs of the different communities across the United States and how we can work collaboratively is the best approach. When thinking about, developing communities, and also those ancillary components. How do we just can't build a bunch of affordable housing, right? And not look to build schools and, after school programs and supermarkets and other amenities to support the housing stock. So, that's been our approach primarily with churches, but also with other not-for-profit organizations as well.
So Erica, your lasagna is blessed, but what type of the services are you talking about that you provide for these faith-based organizations that kind of make the difference?
So, we give them an opportunity to really stay right in their property and not sell it, because often you have, if you think about historically, religious institutions have been huge landowners, right? And you have large organizations like the Catholic Diocese, the Episcopals, who own a tremendous amount of properties across the cities. But then you have independent churches who may have one or two properties, and it's difficult for them to maintain those properties. And they have throughout the years, and in most instances, unfortunately, these have been churches of color. And they have throughout the years divested their property, which was really the only asset that those organizations have had. So what we give them is an opportunity to maintain their properties, to stay on the sites, but also bring in a source of revenue and be a partner in providing something that is essential to anyone's existence, which is housing. And so in these instances, the churches become a partner in the deal. It becomes a source of revenue for them. They're also able to stay on their site, and in most instances, either renovate or get a new building that can now be maintained in a much more efficient and effective way.
So it's a win-win all around.
Exactly.
So while we're focusing, and Darby gave us some good examples, can you tell us a little bit about your Ebenezer Plaza project and how that's special for high level for our development students? How did that deal come about for your firm, and what lessons can the students learn?
So this is sort of a quintessential example of this. This was a church, a very huge church, 1,500 members. They purchased 2 city blocks, and they entered into an owner financing transaction because they could not, even though they had $1.5 million going through their coffers on a regular basis, they could not get traditional financing because banks are hands off with churches because they don't want to foreclose on God, right? So it's so totally a marketing piece where they stay away from churches. So they couldn't find traditional financing for this. They entered into this deal with the current owner, who really, I think, did it with the expectation that they were not going to meet the financing and that they were eventually going to get the property back. And so the church was at that situation where they were technically going to lose the property when we were introduced to them. And what we were able to do was to combine what their vision was to do initially, a new community facility space, both religious and non-religious use. But what we were able to do was to propose rezoning that site to add residential as part of the development in partnership with the agencies as well as the lenders. And so we were able to turn what was envisioned as 2, 40,000 square feet community facility into commercial retail at 25,000 square feet, 40,000 square feet of community facility, and 523 units of affordable housing. And so through that collaboration, we now have something that's transformative for the community, and the church did not lose their property. They were able to become a partner in that transaction.
Anthea, we know you would never foreclose on God. So maybe you could comment though, how is that fundraising capability? How do you bridge that gap? What do you do to help make these projects come alive?
As Erica was talking, I was thinking of a permanent supportive housing transaction that I worked on here in Denver, where the commercial space was a homeless shelter, and they had a lot of services for the residents of the permanent supportive housing space as well as the homeless shelter. And the challenge there was the services. And when you rely on fundraising income for services as a lender, it's very difficult to underwrite that for a 15-year term. There's no security there. So what happens is we have to discount that. So at the end of the day, it ends up impacting the amount of loan proceeds you can have. I'm not sure if that answered your question, Brian, but I'd say fundraising is one of the biggest challenges with the nonprofits. And Erica did mention that it was difficult for banks with churches, et cetera, but I do think that FHA or Fannie or Freddie, you wouldn't have that type of problem. So we need to talk, Erica, for next time.
Okay. I want to give Andrew a chance to talk about some of his more successful projects, the Sendero Verde, and then I want to hear the story behind the Gowanus Green as well. So why don't we start with the Sendero Verde? Please explain that development deal. Who were the partners, and what are some of the lessons we can learn from that project?
Sure. So Sendero Verde was a winning response to a city RFP that was really designed to really push the envelope on building sustainable buildings. So issued under the de Blasio administration, when it's completed, will be the largest affordable passive house project in the country. I think Darby's group still holds the title on that, I believe. And, I guess, so it's a partnership with L&M, and we have a number of, it's been a very forward-looking, project that will provide over 700 units of affordable housing, a new charter school, and a number of other community benefits. I mean, I think tying that into Gowanus Green was a response to a project under the Bloomberg administration with the same intent to really try to put forward a public site that pushes the envelope on sustainable building. And that project will be 950 units in 6 buildings with a public school. And we could spend a whole hour talking about that. But I think, oftentimes, I think one of the lessons is oftentimes that innovation can happen when the public sector puts forward a challenge to kind of push the envelope and demonstrates not just through contributing land, but contributing subsidies and other things to really demonstrate what is possible in building green. So we're taking some of those lessons forward. I know we're working with Darby's team on building another passive house project in Brooklyn. That model has been successfully replicated across the country. And also maybe just a segue to a project that Erica recently won. So if there's any of my students who have joined, that last summer we spent the entire summer focused on the Brownsville RFP, which was a public RFP in Brownsville, Brooklyn, rooted on a really extensive community planning process to award 3 sites, which Erica's group was actually one of the proud winners of. And I think it demonstrates 2 things. One, to Erica's point about building, with that, real focus on responding to what the community needs and making sure that their voice is heard from the very beginning, before any buildings even get envisioned. But 2, the idea that it's not just about the housing, but it's about what goes along with the housing. And I'd love, if there's time, we probably will run out of time, but Erica could speak to, she built, I think 230, she's going to build 230 units of affordable housing, but that's just a component of it. It's really this entrepreneurial hub that she's building, which is going to really just supercharge the neighborhood and provide jobs and economic opportunity. And I think that's another trend and a lesson learned. And so we are housing developers primarily, but really a lot of what we need to do is build the components in our buildings that allow our residents to thrive and the communities around them to continue to grow. And it's not just about the housing, it's all the components that go with it.
I love the passion, Andrew, and how you're talking about the built environment in a larger sphere. It's not just about housing, but what the housing could do and what it contributes to the neighborhood, as Erica mentioned. Gerard, you are extremely passionate about this subject. You've devoted your life to it, and you have a new firm. You're chasing RFPs right now. Tell us a little bit about the process of how one goes about going after these deals.
Yes, so different agencies and cities have assets and they need something, right? Many cases like New York, we need housing, but in many other cities, they want to create jobs, right? And creating jobs has this kind of multiplier effect, because if you create jobs, they got to live somewhere, they got to shop somewhere, they got to eat somewhere, they got to get some coffee somewhere. So there's this kind of multiplier effect. So RFPs, entrepreneurial developers can help solve a problem. I think for young folks out there in your kind of trajectory, it just happened, Andrew and I are on the entrepreneurial side. We went to school together, but we actually have lots of friends that we went to school with who are also on the public side, right? So that's the other way that you could impact this. You could actually work on the government side and help create policy, right? Help create financing structures to incentivize these things. So that's the other kind of side of the table. One of my former students, works for the state now. They're financing housing across the state of New York. That's an additional way to participate in the process, not only from this standpoint as well.
Yeah, we're accepting questions now from the chat, and a few have come up that I'm going to read off now, if that's okay with you.
Cool.
So one gentleman, Mr. Farrell, asks, I would love to hear your thoughts on timber skyscraper options within New York space. Andrew, I don't know if you can comment on that. Is timber a new material now that affordable housing is looking at, or we can also ask Darby her opinion of that as well?
It's one of our favorite topics around the office because we're all eager to build, skyscrapers out of wood. We're still a long way to go. The fire department doesn't think it's such a great idea. When you look historically, building low-rise buildings out of wood has been something we've been doing for a couple hundred years. The real challenge is to build buildings that can go up vertically over 8 stories out of wood. It's not only there's carbon benefits. The wood kind of absorbs carbon and captures it, which is really great. Unfortunately, I think we're still quite a ways away from when we'll be able to actually build building. And when we say mass timber buildings, we're talking about buildings that are over, 5, 6 stories, because you could build those out of wood today. It's really buildings that are 15, 20 stories, which is possible. It's just a matter of getting the building codes and the local fire departments to, agree that, the
But
buildings will
Eric,
stand up.
as a builder, you've seen materials change over time, and there are many more sustainable things you could do in a building today that wasn't possible 5, 10 years ago. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, I think that, when I hear about or think about like timber and such, we really sort of dismiss those things in a way, because I just think in New York City, there's just so many nuances and so many considerations given the density of where we are, that we have to be really, I don't know if there's that flexibility to have that level of creativity, that we just have to think about being as safe as possible. I mean, I think that we're in a difficult time now with the supply chain issues and just construction costs escalating at a rate that is, far ahead of the subsidies that are available and the tax credit equity that is available. And so we try to think as creatively as possible. I think Darby's presentation on passive house, and even if a building isn't fully certified passive house, to include passive house elements, thinking about the health of the community, like active design, and, maybe lessening costs by one less elevator bank and making more stairwells available, and ways in which people can naturally exercise in a place like New York City that is dense and has, height to buildings and such. So, we're thinking about those ways in which we can, in the most cost-effective way, be, creative about supporting health and the carbon environment and the building's footprint and such.
So I'd be remiss if I didn't ask our architect to weigh in on this, and then we'll do another subject question.
Yeah, when we talk about it now, it's as similar with passive house, which started in Northern Europe. There's much more timber going on in Europe than there is here. There's no question. New York City it's going to be a while before New York City works out all the nuances, and the fire department and everyone else is satisfied that it's a safe way of building, which is all very important in New York City. Bureaucracy takes a while for all this. But again, it goes to, the bigger question of how can we and this, comes from, us as designers working with you as developers and builders, what innovative things can we do with what is available that can reduce costs, create a healthier building, create a more sustainable building, and looking at ways to work with what we have, trying to break out of the box whenever we can. And it's also, when I think Gerard mentioned this, for those who may be interested in working on the policy side, it's also, we spend time working with government agencies and not-for-profits and developing new policy for New York City. Code takes longer than anything else does, but so, that helps on for instance, there's been a lot of discussion about the funding side, and sustainability, for whatever reason, doesn't get additional funding, but it should. So there's a policy shift that needs to be made, working with the banks and various others.
Oh, working with the banks. We'll go back to Anthea then. Anthea, how do these policy change affect you? Or is lending affected by all these innovations?
Oh, absolutely. Specifically in the sustainability realm that Darby was referring to, we've had PACE out there as a solution for a while now. And I have not seen it work on a deal yet, at least on the multifamily side. I think a lot of things will need to change to make that work. But the limits, even if we had PACE financing, is it true sustainability? Is it really funding as much green innovations as we need today? I would say it doesn't. So policy, unfortunately, is a little bit behind when it comes to sustainability, but it does come down to the funding sources.
Yeah. And Gerard, what would you have to say on that?
I think that the future of buildings is they're getting greener, they're getting smarter, and we're getting healthier, to the point Erica just made. So one example is the WELL certification program, where LEED looks at how is the building impacting the environment, right? The air, the water, but WELLS looks at how's the building impacting us. What's the air we're breathing? What's the quality of water that we're consuming in the building? So I think to Anthea's point, some of these things haven't quite made it to the capital side where they're incentivized to do it yet. but I think that's the direction where things are going. And hopefully, we can create some policy like in New York. We have this thing they call, Local Law 97, where they've mandated that we have to make our buildings green in X amount of years. And everybody's scrambling to try to catch up to figure out how can we meet the mandate that's coming about. So that's one way to do it.
Gerard, you and I had a conversation earlier where you were doing your final projects in a class yesterday, and a student proposed an interesting idea in Atlanta. Do you want to comment on that, and then the whole idea of Section 8 housing?
Yeah, one of my students did a fascinating thing that he proposed buying Section 8 properties. To the point, somebody's question there in the Q&A, why are investors interested in investing in Section 8 housing? And I knew it as soon as he started. I was like, he's been doing his research. He talked to somebody. That there's lots of institutional investors across the country that specifically invest in Section 8 housing because it's supported by the federal government. The federal government pays over 66% of the income of the building. So kind of sort of the government guarantees the income of the building. And as we all know, in most of these major cities, there's no vacancy problem in the affordable housing stock. So you have a building that's pretty much full and the government is supporting over 66% of the income stream. So there's investors out there that specifically invest in that. So one of my students actually in his final presentation, undergrad too, kids like 19, 20 years old, came up with a strategy and like, yes, this is important and this is how I'm going to do it. And this is why it's financially feasible. And everybody kind of looked and he was just like, yeah, like we could do this now. We all could go out and do this. And like, I was like, he was listening.
And Thea, do you agree with that student's concept, or are people attracted to Section 8 investments?
Yeah, I would say certainly over the past couple decades, Section 8 has been destigmatized, and it is seen as a wonderful asset to add to a portfolio. I mean, it really balances out if you have higher risk assets. It's a low risk. The nice thing about Section 8 is that it has a long-term HAP contract. So it's typically a 20-year housing assistant payment contract, which is like gold in the lending world because you've got guaranteed income coming in for that period of time. Section 8 is also really competitive these days. So I think at some point it might have been easier to acquire those types of properties. These days, it's hard to get your hands on any of them. And as Gerard knows, you can also go through and do what's called a mark to market. So if you prove that there's any way to add value, you can even request that those rents be increased, sometimes even above where market rate rents are.
Erica, what's the impact of the Rad program? We hear a lot about it. Oh, you're laughing in the public housing sector, but I'm just curious what your take is on it. Up.
You're muted.
Saying that this was just a perfect segue into the Rad program, right? Which is, the rental assistance demonstration program. And it's been, sort of controversial in New York in that, everyone is just saying, oh, you're privatizing public housing. But I think it is really a smart way to address the fact that across, not just in New York City with New York, Housing Authority, but across the United States, there is literally close to $26 billion of deferred maintenance of these assets, right? And so that's people putting in tickets that don't get addressed for a year, right? And we see the deplorable conditions that have existed. And so it's really key that we think about smart ways in which we can mend public and private financing to address those issues. And as we're going through the process, we just see it kind of getting worse because you see the public agencies are pulling back from the already deferred maintenance that's happening. However, I think the faster they get through rounds and the more that this opportunity avails itself, we will see a way in which to improve public housing and make it, a place where people can live affordably and comfortably and at the same level that other affordable housing assets through tax credits and market rate look, right, and feel, and the 421As and all of these combinations. So, I firmly support the Rad program. I think that, you know, the bureaucracies that it has to go through, that's just a reality. But I think the end game, it is a good one in terms of making Section 8 housing really top level, top tier quality.
Okay, we have one more question coming in from the audience, and then I'm going to give you some time to sum up. This went by really quickly. Ben Finkley is asking, could you kindly reiterate why institutional investors are seeking to invest in affordable housing? Is it just the low but stable cash flows, or is there more to it?
I'd say the stable cash flows is an important part about it, that it's consistent, reliable income. To Anthea's point, you know, for years, it was more so like private equity firms, folks that needed not such a high return, but that pool has definitely opened up over the last couple of years. There's a lot more people investing in all multifamily housing across the board, you know, and affordable housing is no different. There's lots of investors across the board. And if you think about it, there's less people investing in commercial real estate, right? There's less people investing in retail real estate, less in hotel, multifamily, and industrial. You know, they've been kind of the darling in this last couple of years.
Yeah, so I think that's a good summation from Gerard's standpoint. What are you expecting from the lending community moving forward, Anthea?
I think we've seen a shift from the lending community, more socially minded investing, so social impact investing. I hope that we continue to see that. Social impact can also be the ESG, so the sustainability investing that we've talked about as well as affordable housing. I think everyone is just mindful that we all have to do our part, and that means putting our money in the right places.
And Darby, we found out that building timber affordable housing is difficult, but we can still dream. Where do you expect affordable housing to move forward going in the next couple of years?
I mean, I think, you know, with Local 97 and various other things, I think in certain ways, affordable housing is at the forefront of sustainable housing in New York City and hopefully elsewhere, because there are more regulations associated with it. You know, part of our hope is that the funding sources start recognizing that. That's one element. Timber is an exciting way to do it. Less expensive, gives more flexibility in design and various other things. So we're hoping within the next 5 to 10 years, that's something we can start really looking at even more seriously.
Erica, I'm really amazed at the power of your passion for your faith-based organization and the building that you've been able to achieve moving forward. The project sounds interesting. How do you maintain that positivity, and where do you see the affordable housing industry moving?
You know, I hope that we continue to, you know, the city is able to sort of right size the equity and the tax credit equity and the subsidies available, so that we can continue to build affordable housing, and that, you know, we create a real utopia where there isn't really like, you know, a salad where there's carrots here and, you know, tomatoes over here and lettuce here, but that we really do have, you know, sort of a gumbo, a mixing of people and of different races and socioeconomic status. And I see affordable housing as an opportunity to do that. And so, you know, I hope that there is this consciousness from everyone to contribute and think about policy in a way to further that.
Well, Andrew, I just want to have some of that gumbo right now, but
Absolutely.
I'm giving you the last word on this spectacular affordable housing gumbo stew that we've been kind of imbibing in right now.
Well, yeah, and just to echo Erica's point, I think we're at a moment where we're hopeful to see some changes in how we build that will allow us to further build housing in areas and kind of mix the salad up a little bit, because I think we've all recognized that that's what's going to make communities better. We're better together, and I think there's a lot of headwinds right now in building affordable housing with costs and all that. We've touched on it, but I think that the need remains the same, and I think the goal that Erica outlined is what we all get up in the morning to do is to build the kind of
And I
communities that she's talking about.
will echo that, Andrew. We're better together for spending this last hour with you. I want to thank Professor Gerard Delane for pulling our esteemed guests, Darby Curtis, Andrew Foley, Erica Keller, and Anthea Martin, so that we could have this very intelligent discussion, but really only scratching the surface of affordable housing. If you're interested, Andrew is teaching a summer class again, is that correct?
Yes, thanks for the plug.
Yeah, and another big plug to Gerard. Gerard, you have a very interesting program that you put forward to the provost. Do you want to explain a little bit about it in terms of continuing education?
Yes, starting this fall, we're going to have an affordable housing certificate at NYU. So if you're a young person who wants to get into the industry, or you're an experienced person that just wants to sharpen your skills, we're going to have some courses at NYU that you'll be able to participate in. So be on the lookout for that.
Well, I'm very excited that you were able to join us today. Thank you very much for tuning in to our faculty series, and we look forward to speaking to you again in the near future. Thank you, everyone, once and for all. Bye-bye.